My name's John Graham. I'm the badass granddad you didn't know you had. A while back, I was hitchhiking through the colonial war in Algeria. That's right, hitchhiking. And I had taped an American flag on my chest in the hopes that the rebels wouldn't shoot me as a Frenchman, and they didn't. Anyway, I was in the middle of Algeria, and late afternoon, and I was walking into this small village with a dusty main street. I thought it was deserted, but there was another guy on the other end of the street. Comes up to me, and he's yelling and weeping and waving a bottle of wine. And he comes up to me, he sees the American flag on my chest, and he gets down on his knees in the dirt and grabs my legs and asks me if I could please stay with him for the night and have dinner with him. Well, I could hear machine guns in the distance, so I figured, hey, why not? So we go to his house, this old French farmhouse, and he goes in and he draws 6 deadbolts across the door, and he heats up some lamb stew. It tasted like kerosene, but I was really hungry. And over dinner, he tells me about the stories of what life was like before the war started. His wife would play the guitar out there into the grape arbor. And the legionnaires and his neighbors would sing, and they would dance, and life was really copacetic. And then the war started, and people started dying on both sides. And he began to weep some more and cry. And everybody was gone but him, but he wasn't going to leave because his family had been there for 200 years, and he just wasn't going to leave. He goes over to a cabinet, brings down a bottle of cognac, and he says he's been saving for a special occasion, and we finish it off. I go to bed, he's got one bed, and so I lay down on one edge of it. In the middle of the night, this guy has this terrible nightmare, and he tries waving his huge fist. And so I drop off the bed onto the floor, grab my rucksack, flee out the door, and go 100 yards or so to an orange grove outside of town.
What's up, guys? Welcome to the Wolf of Young Street podcast. My name is Victor. I'm your host. Today, my guest is John Graham. He is the executive director at Giraffe Heroes. Giraffe Heroes is a nonprofit telling the stories of compassionate risk takers, ordinary people like you and me doing extraordinary things, tackling public problems in the U.S. and around the world. Before Giraffe Heroes, though, John served for 15 years in the United States Foreign Service. He was in Libya during the revolution by Muammar Gaddaffi. He served in Vietnam as well. And that doesn't cover all the adventures that John has been on. So I'll let him tell you all about it today. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I had to make sure that I cover my bases there. That's why I had to write down the script so I know how to introduce you. You've done so many things. It's hard to summarize you into a good intro.
Well, I am 82 years old, so, I've been around. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with your country just went through an election. How did you see that? You've been around. You've seen a few presidents in your time.
Yeah. Well, I'm disappointed. I wanted Harris to win. No one knows what's going to happen next, but it's probably not going to be good. Donald Trump has a way of trying to do whatever he says he's trying to do. And if he tries to do all of that, I think we're in real trouble. He'll withdraw from NATO. He'll withdraw from the Paris Peace Accords. He'll try to deport 20 million people. He says he'll do all that. He'll gut the civil service. I mean, this could be a disaster. It would drive up inflation, terrorize the rest of the planet. On the other hand, that's the worst case scenario. The problem is, I think, is that last time he was president, there were some bumpers, there were some guardrails. And in fact, he had a number of people around him who were basically responsible Republicans, and they kept him from doing a lot of the wild, crazy stuff he wanted to do. This year, not the same. He's gotten rid of all those people, and he's surrounded himself with crazies, in my opinion. And not only that, it looks like he'll have the total support of Congress. So it could be bad. In my opinion, it could be bad. And then again, the other thing I want to say is that, and here I disagree with some of my own progressive friends in the United States. I mean, I think that this is a huge change election. I mean, on the order of bringing in FDR in the 30s. I think America is really due for a total realignment because the Democratic Party didn't lose a squeaker. They got flattened. And every state, every city, whatever, the American people just didn't like the Democrat message, and they much preferred Trump, even though most people, Republicans and Democrats, thought the guy was nuts. And not only that, but the last couple months, he looked terribly senile. But they still voted for him because they were basically voting against what the Democrats were standing for. And there was Harris saying all the right things. I mean, subsidies for new homeowners and continuing some of the Biden construction infrastructure projects, all that kind of stuff. And of course, she was on the right side in terms of the progressives. She was on the right side in terms of all the culture war issues, most prominently women's choice, but also all the LGBTQ issues and all the rest of it. So, people were looking at that, and they still didn't vote for her. And it's because there's a real sense of stagnation in this country. And I don't think we're alone. I think Canada suffers from it, most of the world. By stagnation, I mean that the ordinary Joe, the great middle class, thinks they're going nowhere. You have to work 2 jobs to make ends meet in most of the United States. You can't buy a home. I mean, homes are only for rich people now. It's hard even to buy a car to get to work. I mean, the economy, the inflation may be conquered now, but what happened 3 years ago, the people didn't forget it. And they're a lot poorer now in many ways. So it's kind of almost ironic that the price of eggs turned out to be more important than the price of democracy. And you can shrug your shoulders if you're, white, college-educated like me. You can say, oh, how can you possibly do that? This man represents a real threat to democracy. This could be our last election, for God's sake. And you're worried about the price of eggs? And some housewife in Nashville, Tennessee will look me in the eye and say, yes, God damn it, I am worried about the price of eggs, and you don't seem to give a damn. And, that's what's going on. And there's a real disconnect. This is 2 countries now. Really 2 countries. It's always been split between coastal elites and the heartland, but now it's like 2 countries. We're not even talking to each other, and increasingly people are hating each other. So it's time for a real realignment. I don't know whether we get rid of the political parties and start over again or whatever. But the fact that this election wasn't close, if it had been close, I'd say, elections come, elections go, we'll suffer through 4 years, we'll get back. That wasn't this election. This wasn't this election, Victor. The Democratic, it wasn't just Harris. Harris ran a brilliant campaign. I mean, people will be writing books about how smart she was in terms of how she handled the 3 months she had to campaign. So I don't think it was Harris. I think it was what the Democrats were offering. And also, I have to admit, a part of me agrees with my wife, who is convinced that there's a misogyny factor, that Americans the rest of the world has been ready for women leaders forever, and we're not. There's just too damn many testosterone pumped males in this country to elect a woman as president. And I'm writing a blog piece on that too, for Victor, because I think it's true. I spend a lot of time thinking about men and manhood issues. I do a lot of mentoring and a lot of writing about it.
Right.
And, it's the cowboy mentality down here, which, by the way, is totally false. The American West was never like that portrayed in American Western movies. I mean, most of those people out there riding horses in the 1870s and 1880s were poor as dirt, uneducated, suffering. And most of the power structures in 19th century Western America were guys that owned the land and the ranches and the oil and all the resources. And they were running the West, not the cowboys. The idea of the American cowboy has always been a myth, but it's a wonderful myth. I mean, we made a lot of movies about it.
Right.
John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, all that. But still, it's a myth that's caught on. And so you have the myth of the American cowboy, maybe epitomized by President Ronald Reagan 30 years ago. But it's like, I'm big and strong, and that's what it takes. And I protect my women, and I don't take shit from anybody. And I don't. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I
think that was a huge factor. And what I'm in the middle of a blog piece now, the gist of which is what did Harris in was men, because she did not get as big a turnout among women voters in this country as everybody thought she would. We thought that the abortion issue was so powerful that women would just stream to the polls. And of course, women vote Democratic more than Republican in this country.
Right.
So we kind of thought that would be the clincher. Well, it didn't happen. They go into the polls on reasonable numbers, but what happened, and it surprised the hell out of everyone, was that young men came to the polls in America in way greater numbers than people thought, because traditionally they don't give a damn about elections.
This is true.
And it wasn't color either. It was white, black, and brown men who came to the polls totally unexpectedly, and they drove the numbers up, and they elected Donald Trump. So what I'm puzzling through is what the hell is going on with men in America? And I think it has a lot to do with machismo and manhood issues. I just, by the way, finished putting up on, of all places, TikTok. I'm doing a series of short 3-minute videos for the 20-something crowd called Badass Granddad. And the last one was on manhood. And in 3 minutes, I'm trying to analyze this for young people.
And so that's where I wanted to go next, actually. So, yeah, you did speak about like manhood and how that eventually that may have influenced the U.S. election. So let's start from that in terms of like background. Obviously, you discovered a certain type of manhood as a young man, which eventually that changed as you kind of grew up and found a different way. So I wanted you to kind of like tell us that story. 16 shipping off on a freighter.
Yeah, it ends up being very relevant to our current conversation on politics.
Yeah,
it will help also. Help your viewers understand that I'm not nuts and that I really have thought a lot of this stuff through, and I have a lot of experience.
Right.
I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, in a very placid little city, and everything in my town and my community and my family was completely ordinary. Unfortunately, I grew up as a spindly little kid, and I was horribly bullied by the bigger, tougher kids, and I never forgot that. And so I was, as a young man, preteen and teen, desperate, looking for role models of manhood because I wanted to hit back at these bastards. And my own dad, I loved him, of course, but he was an extraordinarily gentle man. And he himself was shoved around all the time. He never got promotions at work because other more aggressive males kept shoving him to the side. So I looked at him and I thought, oh, Dad, I can't, you're not the mold. You're not the model. I gotta do something. It turned out, through all the details, but it turned out that when I was just 17 years old, I got a summer job on a freighter. In those days, a freighter was a ship, not a container ship. They hadn't been invented yet. It was a big ship full of cargo run by 50 or 60 really tough guys. I mean, tough guys. And I hadn't been on that ship but a couple of days and out on deck, and one of the crewmen starts making sexual advances toward me. And another crewman, a big black guy named Roy, he comes up to this guy, grabs him around the throat, shoves him against the bulkhead, and unleashes a string of cussing that was just magnificent. Bashes the guy around the head, throws him down on the deck, and the guy sort of slinks off. And I thought, oh, wow. Because I'd never seen real violence before, and I'd never seen that kind of cussing. And I remember going back down to my cabin that night and in front of the mirror practicing cussing like Roy, you motherfucking son of a bitch. And it made me feel really good. So I thought, oh, that's what real men do. This is what real men do. They stand up for other people and they beat the shit out of people they don't like. So, yeah. And then the very next year, I was hitchhiking. And it turned out that one of the things I did, because I'd always had an adventurous spirit, even if I was not very strong, I found myself hitchhiking in Algeria during the closing days of the colonial war there between the French and the French Foreign Legion on one side and the rebel army on the other. And the war was winding down, and the rebels were winning, and the French were collecting themselves and going back to France. So I just walked into Algeria in the middle of this war, and I put an American flag across my chest so that nobody would take me for a French person and shoot me. And it worked just fine. The rebels stopped cars going in my direction at gunpoint and told the driver to take me wherever I wanted to go.
Right.
So I was young and naive, and I was just having a great time. I was in the middle of a war. Nobody was killing me. So yeah, there we are. And then one night outside of Orleansville, I guess it was, there was a lot of shooting. So I went up to what was left of the French Foreign Legion establishment at Orleansville. Three guys that ran the power plant.
Right.
And they were basically surrounded by the rebel army, and they had a few pistols and a machine gun and a couple of sticks, I guess. I mean, and these three guys who felt they could take on the entire rebel army. I mean, these three guys were, one was a Brit, one was a German, One was an Arab of some nationality, I'm not sure. But they had
Right.
tattoos up one side and down the other, and they were burnt black, and they had scars,
Wow.
And they were sitting there drinking wine and having fun, and they didn't give a shit about the machine guns going off around them. They were brave, and they were fearless. And, oh, wow, these are even better than the guy on the Golden Bear, whose name was Roy. These three guys became my heroes, too. So I really began to collect what a hero was. A hero was violent. A hero was unstoppable.
Right.
And I wanted to be that kind of hero, too. So I set out setting up a life to do that. I ended up going to college, and the first thing I did was build myself a body. I mean, I started rowing crew, put on 30, 40 pounds of muscle.
Yeah.
And I became a pretty fierce person in my own right, a real badass. And then I hitchhiked around the world at.
So, I just wanted to preface that just so people don't get lost in your story. So this was the part where you went. This was when you were still at Harvard, right? And then you joined the rowing club.
I graduated from Harvard and then joined the Foreign Service, which picks up the thread of what you were saying.
Yeah. So before you get there, though, you're skipping over, and I know I'm trying. I'm making you tell. I'm making you double back on your own story here, but you need to tell the story because I know the story because I read the book, right? But there's the part about like the going up the Mount McKinley, like the never again repeated climb up that mountain. You can't skip over that. That's an important part.
Okay. We'll be here forever. But yeah, I'll tell you what. The bumper sticker version of that was I realized from the time on that freighter and that episode in Algeria that my whole life had to be about physical adventure. And then when I finally built myself a body and I could survive and prosper out there because I was big and tough, then almost 2 meters tall and tough. Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. Anyway, and part of that was climbing mountains. And part of that was what Victor was alluding to. I was with a team of climbers that made the first ascent of the north wall of then Mount McKinley. Now it's called Denali. And it was even taller than the north wall of Everest. It was the tallest, fiercest mountain wall in the world. And no one had climbed it because it was too dangerous. Avalanches swept down it almost on a daily basis, and anyone trying to climb it would be killed for sure within days. Well, the 7 of us were nuts. And we decided that we could find a path up through the avalanches they would miss. And so we went to Alaska and started up this wall, and whoa, there was one close call after the other. I remember once I was down at the bottom of a 700-foot cliff, and I was just getting out of the tent, and all of a sudden an avalanche and rockfall started coming at me from the top of the cliff. Now the guy I was with had already gone out to take a whiz, and so he was safe under a buttress of some kind, but I was stuck out there and I couldn't move. And this whole flood of rocks, some of them bigger than basketballs, came straight at me.
Wow.
I'll never forget. I didn't move a muscle. And this whole huge mess of big rocks came right at me, and every single one of them missed. I mean, they came so close they parted my hair, but they didn't hit me. And so I really began after that realizing that I led a charmed life. This is an important point. Thank you for stopping me earlier, because this is an important point of my story. There were other adventures too, but in each case I survived. I walked away from it. So in my naivete as a young man in my 20s, I came to the conclusion that I was indestructible, that nothing would ever kill me.
As you do.
I started hitchhiking around the world, and, I would do just wild and crazy things. I was writing a series of stories on the war in Cyprus, for example, and I would go out to the battle lines, the ceasefire lines between the Greeks and the Turks on Cyprus, taking notes to file my stories. I was working then as a stringer for the Boston Globe, and, nobody did that. No reporters were that stupid to walk right down the ceasefire lines with guns pointing at him from both directions.
Yeah.
But then I was convinced I was indestructible, and I walked away from it, And then I continued doing more of that, hitchhiking around the world, doing reports on Laos. And that was also my first visit to Vietnam, even before the American War started.
I actually want to stop you there, because part of what I found interesting was you hiked through, I don't know if it was this trip, but you hiked through Gaza and the West Bank in the period before it really became what it is now. And I wonder what your perspective on what it was then and how it's kind of devolved to what it is now
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, no, I've had a lot to do. We're jumping around here, but that's okay. You got a bunch of smart viewers. They can hop back and forth with us. So we're screwing up the timeline, but that's great. The first time I was in the Middle East, I was young and in hitchhiking. So in those days, it was before the '67 war. So I spent a lot of time with the Arab community, the Palestinian community. And I will tell you that then, this was 1965, I
Right.
would sit down in a cafe in East Jerusalem, for example, or no, it wasn't. Yeah. Anyway, Jericho it was. Places like Jericho, and I would soon collect a bunch of young Palestinians who were eager to try out their high school English on me.
Mm.
And even then, you could cut the hate with a knife.
Hmm.
I mean, they hated Jews. These were young men in 1965, and they hated Jews because of the history. And most of your viewers know that in 1947, 1948, when the state of Israel was created, they ended up shoving a whole lot of Palestinians out of their homes in Israel, and that started the generations of hate that continue to this day.
Right.
That the Palestinians feel totally dispossessed, and not without some reason.
Right.
Because that's what happened to them when the state of Israel was created. I mean, we could talk all afternoon on the creation of the state of Israel and the stupid mistakes Britain and France made, but never mind. So anyway, and these young men were the sons or grandsons of the people shoved out of what was then Israel. And they had a level of hate, like I said, that was just enormous. And you could see coming what was coming. The intifadas and then the wars, it was never going to stop because the level of hate was so extreme. So when it continued, and let's see, should I leap way ahead? Well,
before you actually leave that, before you leap to the next one, because I do want to, while I want to dwell on the history, but I sort of want to place you in points in history and kind of relate it to modern events a little bit. So we might jump around a little bit. You just bear with me, guys, at home. So with that perspective, having seen sort of the simmering hate and sort of the aggression coming down the road there, and you say in your book that you were not surprised when years later it became the problem it has become, even more so now. Right now, looking back on all that, seeing what has gone down this year and over the years in Palestine, between Palestine and Israel, how does that war end? Does it ever end, or is this just going to be a cycle of hate that just perpetuates?
Sitting down with those young men in 1965, I would say it was never going to end, and I don't think I may not be wrong. I got very interested as I became a diplomat, and then even after my diplomatic career as a peace builder in the Middle East, I even helped played a very small role in the creation of the so-called Oslo Accords, creating the outlines of the two-state solution, which I believe is still the only possible answer. There's got to be a Palestinian state there at some point.
Right.
Otherwise, we're left with an apartheid state, and we all know what happens to apartheid states in time. They fall apart.
Right.
I was active, went back and forth in the Middle East a lot as an interlocutor between Palestinians and Israelis. And sometimes we would meet in secret meetings in a castle in Switzerland above Montreux and just have it out for a week and talk about it without the press prying into what we were talking about. Anyway, at one point, and this is, I'll tell this story, I had the feeling that I was talking, and it was so much easier to talk to the Israelis. I was talking more to the Israelis, and I was totally full of their point of view. I got the Israeli point of view. They were terrified at that point of Palestinians strapping bombs around themselves and going into a bus station in Tel Aviv and blowing people up. And they were terrified of that, and they were horrified, and they hated the Palestinians for doing that, just as the Palestinians hated them. So I decided that I needed to get more of the Palestinian story. So I went down to a refugee camp in South Lebanon, and it was run by Hamas. Hamas, now famous for what they did last October 6th.
October 7th, yeah.
October 7th, yeah, a year ago. But Hamas also ran a lot of social welfare things, and they ran the camp, and they ran hospitals and schools and stuff, and basically were the only social service organization the Palestinians had in those deplorable camps, refugee camps in South Lebanon, Jordan, places like that. So I went down there and I talked to them, and I spent a whole day with them, and I got an earful of the Palestinian side of the story, which goes back, like I was alluding to earlier, it goes back to 1947, 48, and the Nakba, when all of the grandfathers and fathers and families were expelled and were thrown out of their houses, and the war really started, and the hate really started, because as you probably know, and most people probably know, that Israelis and Palestinians lived together in peace for decades, centuries. I mean, they're cousins after all. And so, but that all ended in 1947, 48, and things got worse and worse. Anyway, I went down there, and then on the way home, I stopped in Paris, and I was grabbed out of the airport line by the French Sûreté, and it took me down to a small windowless room because people had noticed that I had been to the Hamas camp. Talking to the terrorists.
Yeah.
So they finally let me go, and I came back to the United States. And a few weeks later, I was taking a domestic plane flight down to see my grandkids in California. And I got to the airport, and I'm taken aside and given a formal letter from the U.S. government accusing me of being a threat to national civil aviation and national security, and putting me on the George Bush's no-fly list.
That's
and I was, not only that, but I mean, I was a threat to national security, all because of that visit to the Hamas camp, and also the fact that as a political activist, I'd written a book called "Stick Your Neck Out," advising people on how to raise hell to deal with difficult situations. In any case.
Sorry to interject here.
I was on that list forever, and but I'm just saying that I have a long history in the Middle East. Going up now to your last question about what's going on now and what do I think.
Yeah,
I like a lot of other people who have a lot of experience on either side, or as peacemakers, potential peacemakers like myself. We're just shaking our heads. The hate, if anything, is getting stronger and stronger, and the possibility of a two-state solution fades even more. I don't know if a two-state solution is even possible anymore because of all the land grabs that the Israeli settler population, the right-wing settlers that are propping up Netanyahu, they've taken so much land on the West Bank, there's hardly any room left to create a Palestinian state.
Right.
If that's the solution, then the only other solution is an apartheid solution, where the Palestinians are herded into. In South Africa, we call them Bantustans, where they were herded into places where they could get out only to go to work, doing menial work for the white people in Johannesburg. Well,
that's essentially what it is now, right?
It's pretty damn close to that. It's pretty damn close to that. And so, and of course, what happened in South Africa, I mean, the South Africans are, I don't know, I don't want to say lucky because I don't believe in luck that much. But the fact that Nelson Mandela existed, and then even after, 20 years in prison in Robben Island, he could come back and deal with the white government in such a way that there was, in fact, a fairly peaceful transfer of power to a multiracial government was just amazing, because very few people expected that. Most of us expected a bloodbath in South Africa. It didn't happen, but that was because of some extraordinary people on the scene. And also the whites produced de Klerk, who, while he wasn't everyone's favorite person, at least he had the guts to confront his own right wing and to sit down with Mandela and agree to the terms of the transfer.
Right.
So, but that's not going to happen in Israel. There's no Mandela, there's no de Klerk. You've got a right-wing government. It looks like it's going even further to the right, Netanyahu. And then you've got Hamas on the other side, who are equally adamant on the other side. I mean, there's no excuse, there's no possible excuse for what they did on October 7th. And it will be generations before people will forget that massacre. Just as there'll be generations before people even begin to forget the 30, 40,000 people that have been butchered and bombed, women and children, etc., in Gaza. So it's going to be much harder. My own view is that there just needs to be new leadership and international control of the area. I don't know how that's going to happen. Maybe what happened in Cyprus might be an example where the UN finally stepped in and separated the Turks and the Greeks and prevented a bigger bloodbath. Maybe something like the Good Friday Agreement, which stopped the killing in Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, something like that. But there's got to be a significant peacekeeping force, and then there's got to be some lines drawn. There's got to be some rudimentary boundaries drawn. The peacekeeping force would be people like the Qataris, maybe the Saudis, maybe some Christian Lebanese, maybe a few people from outside, like Canadians or Indonesians, for example. People without so much skin in the game that they would be rejected by either side. But they've got to be there, and they've got to be armed, and they've got to have the power to keep the Israelis and the Palestinians, especially Hamas, from killing each other. At the same time, there has to be a change in leadership. Hamas can never again lead the Palestinian people because the memories will never fade. And Netanyahu, I hope he spends the rest of his life in jail. I mean, the man is a war criminal. But I also know, because I have friends on both sides, that there are a lot of really decent Israelis who really want peace. And they, of course, the Israelis are very competent people. They can produce the leadership. Yitzhak Rabin and the others back in the day, they were good people, good leaders. They could produce those again. The Palestinians on their side have got to get a lot better at picking their leadership. I mean, when Yasser Arafat turned down the Camp David Accords, that was absolutely a disaster. That was the one chance in the last 40 years, for us to put an end to that thing. The deal brokered by the Americans that would have created a two-state solution. And it gave Yasser Arafat virtually everything he wanted, and then he spat on it. And the deal disappeared, and then came the first Intifada, which, as you remember, was a bunch of young Palestinians throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at people. And after that, everybody got too skittish and too scared, and they never even came close to a Camp David Accord again. And even though the work that I did on the Oslo Accords, again, presented possibilities for a two-state solution, that extremists on both sides, and here I blame the Palestinians just as much as the Israelis, in terms of being obstinate when they needed to be a Mandela and a de Klerk, when they needed to see, okay, we're going to have to give up a whole lot to bring peace. And neither side did that, and now it's even worse. The only thing that can, I don't know, I mean, public international pressure may in fact halt the war in Gaza. But what are you going to do then? It'll just erupt in another 5 years or 10 years. It'll just erupt again.
So let's dance back to your story. I stopped you during that hike through the Middle East, and this was on your way to South Australia, I want to say, for your grad school, right? So I'll let you continue from there.
That was part of it, Yeah, so it's interesting because if anything, we've gone backwards from that day when I spent that day in Jericho with people, young men my own age, and felt the depth of their hate. You could see it coming, and it came. So I have right now, things may have to get even worse before they get better. It's hard to say that with 40,000 people in Gaza killed, and Israelis looking over their shoulders for the next round of Iranian rockets, and a real possibility of a major Middle East war erupting. Israel has the bomb. Iran can create a nuclear weapon probably within weeks. So what do we do if Tel Aviv and Tehran both erupt in nuclear flames? I mean, Jesus Christ.
We've talked about that. We haven't even...
A global war at that point.
Yeah, we've talked about that. We haven't even brought in Russia, Ukraine. We'll get to that and the possibility of World War III later in this discussion, because I want to bring that in when we talk about your role at the UN. But I still want to follow your story a little chronologically. So,
all right, okay. So there I am, and I'm hitchhiking around the world, and one adventure after the other. and I come to Australia where I'm supposed to be a graduate student, but by then I'm no longer interested in my career in science, which was geology, because I've had so damn many adventures, and I'm also building a career as a war correspondent for the Boston Globe. So I spend most of my time in Australia drinking beer and chasing girls, and all of it in the outback, and having great fun roaming around the Australian outback. Then I get this letter from the U.S. Foreign Service. I'd taken the exams earlier, and they were offering me a job. So that was the beginning of the whole next 15 years of my life. I came back, joined the U.S. Foreign Service, a diplomatic service. But I never did serve in embassies like in Europe and wear a tie. I headed straight. Most of my career was in jungles and deserts and wars and revolutions, which was perfect for me because I'm still that young man who survived all these violent brushes with death. And so the idea of stamping visas in Madrid didn't really appeal to me. But being in the revolution in Libya in 1969 is like, yeah, I can make money and have a career as a diplomat and still have adventures. And I just loved it. I mean, the rest of the people at the embassy in Tripoli were freaking out when they saw burning cars and mobs. And I just loved it. I just loved it. I mean, that's the kind of person I am. And so right after the revolution in Libya, which was really exciting, those are the days before social media. So the few of us at the embassy in Tripoli were really on our own, trying to figure out what the hell to do with Muammar Gaddaffi, or who the hell he was even. And because I worked a lot with the Libyan military, I had a lot of contacts with the people around him. And so I became a pretty central person in trying to interpret the new Libya. After that, I tell the State Department to send me to Vietnam. I want to go to Vietnam, and not only that, but I want them to put me in the most difficult and dangerous spot they've got.
Why was that? Well, why did you want to be in these dangerous spots? Because I read that in the book, and you were like, you just wanted to be around the action. You wanted to be where the bullets were flying. What was that about?
Exactly. Here I was. You gotta understand that ever since I stopped being bullied as a youngster, I wanted to become a real man, a real John Wayne type, like Roy on the ship, or the French Foreign Legionnaires, or whatever. And my whole life had been oriented around that, and it didn't stop. I mean, being in the revolution in Libya, for example, stuff like that just made me feel even stronger. Since I knew by then from my mountain climbing experiences that I could never be killed, quote unquote, I was willing to go any place because I figured nobody would ever kill me. So I looked around and I said, wait a minute, I've had a lot of adventures, but I've never been in a shooting war. I got to get to a shooting war, see what that's like. Not only that, but I thought, real men fight wars. Yes, real men fight wars. And so it became obvious that I had to go to Vietnam, and I had to go to the most dangerous spot. After all, I knew I wasn't going to get killed, so why not go to the most dangerous spot? And so, I became advisor to the city of Hue, right up against the demilitarized zone, against the demilitarized zone, where then South Vietnam and North Vietnam were separated. My job part of it was doing development work, like building schools and stuff. But right. The other part was very political. I was involved in a lot of political activities and counterintelligence and intelligence operations. For a time, for example, I was even an interlocutor with the Viet Cong. I would go out in the middle of the night and meet with the Viet Cong representatives in little pagodas outside of Hue, and because the U.S. wanted me to pass a message to them, or they wanted to pass a message to the U.S., and I was an interlocutor. So there I was, and it was incredibly dangerous. I mean, I expected to be killed every day, probably with a car bomb in my Jeep. But I never was. I was obviously 6.5 feet tall. I was an obvious target for assassination. But the Viet Cong made a decision, I think, that keeping me alive was in their interest, because they quickly realized that I was very anti-war, which I was. I went there for all the wrong reasons. I went there to prove my manhood, and because real men fought in wars. But I knew that the war was stupid. It was wrong. It was unwinnable, and I began to take some risk in the other direction. I began to send private messages back to Washington. I found a channel to do that with my anti-war views in it, and saying chapter and verse exactly what was going wrong. And I could see it myself on the ground. So basically, I was sending messages back which fully supported what Dan Ellsberg was saying in the Pentagon Papers, that there was no hope. It was the wrong war. It was a bad war, and it was being completely mismanaged by the American establishment. And I could see it. I was in the middle of it. And so I sent these messages. The turnaround point for me, and we spent, 45 minutes, we're finally getting to this turnaround point. The turnaround point for me was a battle in Vietnam, where I, again, came close to getting killed. In this case, it was 1972. Remember, Vietnam fell in 1975. So this was like almost 3 years before Vietnam fell. But the North Vietnamese attacked Hue from the north and from the west. On the east was the South China Sea, and on the south was the only way out of Hue, which was the road down to Da Nang. In any case, the Vietnamese attacked. The South Vietnamese army crumbled, and within a month or two, Hue was basically surrounded, except on the south, by North Vietnamese troops. The North Vietnamese tanks were only 6 miles away. At that point in 1972, the U.S. Army had basically left because of the ceasefire agreements. So there was just a couple of us civilians basically left in Hue, and almost surrounded by the North Vietnamese. And it was simple to say that a helicopter from Da Nang could have picked us off, but that's not true, because we were surrounded by desperate South Vietnamese, and who wanted to get off too, and they would try to get on the helicopter, and we'd have to shoot them off the skids, our own counterparts. No, right. Really. I mean, we would. And so the helicopter rescue was out of the questions. So when it looked darkest, when the North Vietnamese looked like they would overrun the city in a day or two, and if they did, well, I was dead or I'd be captured, one or the other. Turned out the very next morning, the skies cleared, and carrier jets from American carriers off the coast came and basically obliterated the North Vietnamese tanks. They were then, like I said, six miles or so.
Right.
And I survived. But the key thing is what happened before those jets appeared. Because I could see, as the city advisor, that a major problem was the panic in the city. I mean, most of the people had fled. The refugees from Quang Tri, which was the province just to the north, were streaming through the town. There was an utter madhouse. The problem wasn't just the refugees. It was with the South Vietnamese army itself.
Interesting.
And it was full of young men who had probably been dragooned off their rice paddies maybe the week or the month before, and they were frightened out of their wits, and they were drunk and crazy, and they were creating a huge unsettling atmosphere of fear and dread in the city that was even worse than the North Vietnamese. So I went to the deputy mayor. The mayor had fled. The deputy mayor was still there, pretty good guy, and I remember slamming my fist down on his desk and saying, "We have to stop the looting and the pillaging and the raping by your own army." Okay,
right.
Because we've got to restore order in the city. Otherwise, we can't get ammunition trucks through the city for the few people still fighting to defend it. It's really important. And so I remember screaming at this guy that we had to set up a firing squad and start shooting these young men, South Vietnamese young men,
right?
Because they were deserters and they were terrorizing the city. So it's right at that point. I don't know. I like to tell the story like it was between slams of my fist down on this guy's desk. But very soon after that, I remembered coming out of his office and practically crying, putting my head down, saying, "What the heck am I doing? What am I doing here? I hate the war. I know it's the wrong war. My home was 8,000 miles away, and here I am demanding the death of young men I never met who are only doing what they're doing because they're scared.
Yeah.
How could my life be that shallow? How could my life become that shallow? I'm an intelligent, I think, a moral person, and I'm doing something that is just pure evil. And so is everybody else on my side, as far as I'm concerned. But for me, because my motives were only about myself and my own need for adventure, it was especially awful. Right. And it was the lowest point of my life. I could not believe how shallow my life had become at that point. And I
Yeah.
wasn't a kid anymore. You can say your life is shallow when you're 21. Fine, you're 21, but I was 29, and I that's how I felt. And that very next morning, the carrier jets came over, and the danger was past. And I went back to the United States in one piece. Ended up in like encounter groups, discussion groups in California.
Yeah. We'll get into that, but I wanted to actually ask you a question to tie that up. Maybe give your voice some time to rest as well.
Oh, no, no. Yeah, I want you to do this because I can go on, and it's a question. You're the podcast host, so it's up to you to keep me. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm curious about, so part of the way you describe the war in Vietnam at that time was obviously the U.S. was in the process of leaving the war and leaving it to the South Vietnamese to fight the war that they were clearly not going to win. That's the way you describe it. And we have something similar. Again, I said I was going to link it to the modern day. We have something, well, some people call it similar. The withdrawal from Afghanistan in the modern day was described as, at least by the right in U.S. politics, it was described as disastrous and that kind of thing. So I wonder how you assess that. Like, how could they have done it differently? Because the truth is, a lot of U.S. presidents did say they wanted to leave Vietnam. To leave Afghanistan. You know, it was resource sink. There were so many of American young men being sent off to a war that was never ending, and they had to get out in some way or the other. But like, how could they have done it better?
Well, I think you have to go back further than that. I think in many ways, if you think about it, had the U.S. As we all remember, after 9/11, the U.S. sent troops to Afghanistan. Didn't take us but like 6 months to defeat the Taliban and obliterate to defeat Al Qaeda. All right.
Yeah.
If we had defeated Al Qaeda and left the Taliban in power, we would be no worse off than we are now, right? It's the rights of women would be no worse or no better. And many people say, well, that's where the first mistakes were made. We tried to do nation building, nation changing, and we shouldn't have. We fought the Taliban, and there wasn't enough popular support. And here, you're right, the parallels with Vietnam, some of them are very, very clear. And I've written about this. I have blog pieces from the day. The parallels were pretty exact. The American people were losing patience with our war in Afghanistan, where every day, every week, there were new stories of American troops being blown up by roadside bombs and stuff. And the Taliban, just like the Viet Cong, were very clever. They never came at us with a frontal assault, but they kept picking us off in small-scale ambushes and stuff, and it looked like it was never going to end. So American support for the war in Vietnam ebbed, and American leadership says, hey, we got to get out of there. And so we began to withdraw. But as soon as we began to withdraw, of course, the Taliban got more and more emboldened, and things got worse and worse. That brings us to your question. Given that America was pulling out with its tail between its legs out of Afghanistan, could we have possibly done it in ways that didn't create the photo ops on the airport runways in Kabul? And the answer, of course, is yes. And you have to blame all kinds of people. First of all, I blame Donald Trump because he's the one that made the deal with the Taliban and even gave them a date when we'd be out of Afghanistan. Nothing could have been stupider than that. You don't give your enemy a date as to when you're going to withdraw. You keep them guessing because you need to protect your people to the last instant. Well, he told them we were going to be out, and Biden made the mistake of accepting the deal that Trump had made. So there, Biden is saddled with Trump's deal, and he's getting the troops out, and there's no secret about it that the Taliban have spies every place. They know exactly what we're doing. Technically speaking, as a military person, what we should have done is kept everyone at Bagram Air Base at a very highly protected zone near Kabul. And everyone should have collected there. We could have protected all of them until the very last C-140 took off. And instead, for some reason, they decided not to use Bagram, but to use the civilian airfield in Kabul, which was not completely, but largely unprotected. And as we know, there was chaos, and 13 Americans got killed, and it was just awful. That could have been largely avoided just with the tactical decision to use Bagram Air Base, or well-protected air base. And the very last plane out of Bagram would be a bunch of Marines with their rifles at the ready, crawling into the last C-140 and taking off. That's the way it should have gone, but it didn't, because of a tactical mistake of not using Bagram Air Base, but trusting that somehow we could keep control of a civilian airport in the middle of a war we had lost, surrounded by Taliban, half of whom we didn't identify because they were spies in our midst, because they looked like ordinary citizens, and yet they had all kinds of guns and equipment surrounding, right. So we should have. So tactically, I blame Biden. Strategically, I blame Trump. So we can, you can look at that as a multi-party disaster. Yeah.
Okay. So obviously, at this point in your story, to bring it back to you now, you're back in the U.S. You're serving on different committees in the UN. So tell us about that part of the story.
Well, you're leaping ahead a little bit too far. It took me a while. I mean, I didn't turn a light switch and become a good guy. I was in California, and at these these encounter groups. Remember, I said that the lowest point of my life had been that night when I set up a firing squad in Vietnam. So I had to examine that. And I went to this encounter group, several of them, and there was one climactic afternoon. And the leaders of the encounter group separated the men and the women, because it had largely started as a couples group. Mm-hmm. I was then married. And because they wanted to talk about, sexual and gender issues, stuff like that. Right. So I'm there in a room with maybe 17, 20 men and a facilitator or two. And we talk about, it wasn't any secret. I mean, we talk about the fact that everyone is created with both a male side and a female side. Men have and should exercise compassion, and women have and should have ability to wield power and leadership. I mean, right. There are obviously differences between the genders, but nonetheless, there's a lot of stuff that could and should be shared. So anyway, there is the female side and the male side, the anima and the animus in Latin. Okay. So we talked about that. And then out of nowhere, the facilitator says, okay, we've all talked, we've been together a week. We've been talking about each other's life. You all have gotten to know each other. And I want you to tell me, who do you think is the most feminine man in the room? And by that, I mean the person that has the most obvious anima, the person that has is the most compassionate and the most, Yeah. So I think, oh, okay. I've spent a whole week telling these people, kind of like what I just told your audience the first half hour, about my adventure story. Oh, shit, I climbed the highest mountain in North America. I was in the revolution here and the war there. I'm John Wayne, and, because I was scared to do anything else. I wanted to impress these people who were professors and accountants and people who probably never encountered physical violence in their whole lives. And I was being really despicable about it and making an ass of myself. And so anyway, guy asked this question, and without any collaboration, all 17 people pointed to me as the most feminine. I couldn't speak. I said, and I got angry. I said, how didn't you listen to my stories?
I'm John Wayne.
John Wayne. I'm a real man, and the rest of you are wimps. And I got so mad, I walked out of the room, and one of them yelled after me. He says, "Look, you idiot, you don't understand. We're trying to pay you a compliment. We're trying to tell you that beneath all your John Wayne bravado is a real human being that we actually like. There's a real human being buried in there that you've been repressing, and you need to find that human being and acknowledge it." I hurled some final insults, ran out of the room, went running down a path for a mile or two. Then I just sat down and began to cry because I realized the truth of what those men had said, the truth. And it was like a huge weight lifted off my heart. It was like, God, they're right. They're right. And I remembered, for example, that I had a little doll that I kept a few years longer than most boys keep dolls. And my mother got really upset because she was a lovely woman, but she was a tough Croatian peasant, really. And so, at a certain point, her man-child had to be a man. So she took my doll away. And I got it out of the trash and put it back. And she took it away again. I said, okay, all right. So I'd always I had that soft side to me. But ever since I started getting bullied as a preteen, I put like a layer of heavy plywood over my heart. Then came Roy and the ship, and then the French Legionnaires, and then all the stuff that I'd done about I couldn't be killed, I couldn't be destroyed, and I became Mr. Tough Guy, and I left that board in place, and it was killing me. It was killing me. My relationships with other people sucked. My marriage was falling apart. I had no sense of community. I led people, but I led because they feared me, not because they admired me. I was heading for a horrible adult life. And then came this moment in Vietnam and the firing squad, and then the encounter group in California. And I just couldn't take it anymore. It was great because I was in California. The State Department had sent me there because, although it wasn't called that then, I had to work through a lot of PTSD.
Right.
I was walking on the shadow sides of the streets in Palo Alto, California, to avoid sniper fire. I mean, I was really messed up.
Right. Right.
So I leave California and come back to Washington. I'm still in the Foreign Service, but I began looking at ways to change my life. And I began with my own kids. I had 2 little kids then. And I began, taking my daughter to Little League practice and playing ball with my son and just doing some of the things that were so obvious to do if you had a heart,
Yeah.
And I began to soften. There was a lot of backsliding. This was not a steady upward push. There was a lot of backsliding. But I began to crawl out of that hole. By the time I got to the United Nations, 1979, by the time I got to the United Nations, I'd pretty much made that transition. And I came to the United Nations determined to do good in the world because I had been on the wrong side of all these issues, starting wars and revolutions. And now I wanted to end them. I wanted to help end them. I wanted to help deal with the pain and suffering in the world, a lot of which I'd helped cause. I wanted to do something about that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's not what my government wanted me to do. And that's where the next risk came up.
Yeah. So before we get into that next part, I think this is probably a good point for us to talk about manliness. And because this is a huge part of what you do now, trying to guide men and show them what a man can be. So I wonder how obviously you started with this image of a man being this macho fella, and that evolved when you joined this personal growth, personal development group, and that kind of inspired a certain change in you. Eventually that helped you mend your relationship with your father and all of that. So in the modern day, I think where I want you to kind of link that into is because there's a lot of, I would say weird. There's a lot of weird examples of what a man should be now. I would say personally, I feel like a person like Andrew Tate, for example, I don't know if you know who that is a very terrible example of what a man should be. But lots of men look at him as something. And there's many terrible examples out there. What should a real man be?
It's interesting. First thing I want to do before I forget is when we're through taping this part of it, I want you to look at my last TikTok episode, which was put up only this morning. It's 3 minutes on TikTok about manhood, and I'm trying to answer all these questions in 3 minutes, and it's pretty damn good. I just looked at it again. So go to TikTok. You'll see 5 or 6 episodes already there, and the very last one put up today is about manhood. Anyway, So to answer your questions, and I'm asked this question a lot, I think a whole lot of it has to do with role models. And I didn't have the role models I needed as a young man. The role models I got were a negative role model in my father, and then quote, positive, unquote, role models from the guys on the freighter and the French Legionnaires and John Wayne and all the rest of that stuff.
Yeah.
So I never got a role model of what a real man could be. And then the encounter groups in California presented the idea that a real man wasn't necessarily just all violence and anger and misogyny and all the rest of it, but a real man could do really good things in the world. He could be a lover to women. He could be a great member of communities. He could be a real problem solver. He could care. He could care for the planet, as in combating global warming. He could care for his own kids. He could, all of that stuff became apparent to me. And the thing is, and I stressed this on that 3-minute video, is that it just reshaped my life. All of a sudden, I saw what life could be. I wasn't miserable. I could see at least an upward path, although it took me years to attain it. And once I did, and once I began to see the effects of being a man that could also act with compassion and caring for the planet and caring for communities and caring for women and caring for other people, it totally changed my life. And why would I ever want to go back? It just made a huge, huge difference. And that's one thing that I will tell men. And the other thing is that I totally get the role that adrenaline and testosterone play, because I guess I'm full of both chemicals myself. And that needs a release, but it doesn't have to be war. It doesn't have to be beating up on your wife. It doesn't have to be, shall I say so, voting for Donald Trump when he says some outrageous anti-woman quote from his speeches. No. You don't have to do that at all. In fact, just the opposite. Find a life that leads with compassion, that is just as tough, and which you are powerful. The key is balance. The key is balance. To be a real man, you need a balance between power and compassion. Both those things have to operate together. And I'm hardly the first person to say this. I think philosophers have been saying it since the Greeks. That there has to be a balance. And you can be powerful on one hand and a great, fearless leader. And when times are tough, man, you want to be the person in the foxhole with someone because they'll trust you. Right. At the same time, you have to be compassionate. You have to be compassionate. And you have to realize that being compassionate means caring for other people, listening to other people, and especially taking care of those people who aren't nearly as good or as powerful as you are, but need help. It means caring for problems. For example, as a Democrat progressive political progressive in the United States, I need to exercise my compassion and my common sense and really understand what it's like for somebody in some really poor town in Mississippi struggling to feed their family, but working 2 jobs and not being able to do that. These aren't losers. These aren't a basket of deplorables. They're human beings, for God's sake. And you need to have compassion toward that before you can find any solution. And here I fault the Democrats, because the Democrats obviously haven't found that solution. But you need to find that solution so that you're compassionate for the least able, and you're compassionate and you're understanding of people, and can look forward to making a difference by doing compassionate, powerful things. But I'll come back to that key word. I mean, I hope, if nothing else, your viewers come away with that. The key word is balance. Right. To be a real man, you must be powerful and you must be compassionate. Falling short on either one means that you're incomplete. And this is why I do a lot of mentoring with men. Because not so much now, I'm 82, but for a long time, I would take young men out on mountain climbing trips. Right. We're not talking hikes in the hills here. We're talking about climbing trips with ropes. And I would get some guy, let's say, for example, someone put him on my trip, and he's had a lot of problem with bullying. Maybe he's had a problem with substance abuse, and he's a real asshole to his other people. I put a rope on him, and then 300 feet above the ground, we'll have a little conversation, and he's peeing his pants. Jesus Christ, we're not going to get killed. If you do what I tell you to do, you won't get killed. We'll get up this cliff and we'll get down the other side. And then around the campfire that night, we talk about, were you scared? No. Well, yeah, I was scared. Okay, all right, that's fine. It's great that you're scared, because that means that you're alive. Now, let's talk about the fact that what pulled you out of there was, first of all, me, because I know what I'm doing. I'm a good mentor for you. And second of all, you stayed calm. And that helped pull you through it when you had to put your foot in a certain place so as not to get yourself killed. So I do a lot of taking young men on tough trips when their tongues are hanging out and they haven't got an ounce of strength left. And then we'll have some good conversations about what a real man is, okay? A real man is able to climb this cliff and not get killed, fine. But at the same time, when you come back down, understand that this kind of manhood, this kind of toughness applies to your community, for example, where you've got to get your city council to do something different, and there's a bunch of assholes, and your only reaction is to lash out at them. Well, don't do that. Have some compassion and try to understand why the city council people you oppose are thinking the way they do, so that you can get close enough to them so that a modest amount of trust may develop so you can actually solve the problem. I wrote a book on change activism, on being a political activist. The book is called Stick Your Neck Out. And in that book, I talk a lot about the need to find solutions by changing the political center of gravity of situations. Right. And the key teaching story, I won't go into it in depth, but the key teaching story in this book is my own activities as a leader of the environmental movement here where I live in Island County, Washington State. And to make things work, I had to deal both with my own left wing and with the right wing. My own left wing were really angry people who were just sick and tired of the Donald Trumps of the in the county trashing the environment and saying all kinds of awful things and not caring about cutting down the last redwood or the last old growth tree or whatever. And of course, the right wingers, from their point of view, didn't seem to have anywhere near the caring they needed about clean air, clean water, about development planning, sensible housing, all that kind of stuff. And so the two sides hated each other. And I stepped into the middle of this because I realized that if I just sided with the left, we would almost certainly win a bunch of court fights. But then as soon as our back was turned, the right would come back and hit us. Or if they win the court fights in a few more years, we'd come back when their back was turned and hit them. So there had to be something more permanent, and that was to establish a political center of gravity. And to do that required trust. So I demanded of the 30 or so people in my working group that we spend at least an hour or two a week going out of our way to talk to the opposition, which meant sitting on a lot of tractor fenders and hay bales talking to farmers because they were our biggest opponent. Farmers didn't want any restrictions on their land use, and they hated those of us that wanted to put restrictions on their land use in order to protect the water supply. So there had to be an understanding that if we kept pushing farmers to pull the fences back from the wetland to just the point where the lefties really wanted them, we meant that he had that much less land to serve as collateral for the bank. And the collateral from the bank is what he used to buy seed in the spring and maybe to send his kids to college for the first time in that family ever. And we need to understand that. We need to understand what farmers thought. At the same time, I began to gain some allies among the farmers, and they sort of did the same thing. And they would talk to their people that, hey, John Graham and some of those people around him, they're not crazy. They really want clean air and clean water. Isn't that we want too? We don't want to drink shit. We want clean water. And so it took it took 4 years, actually, back and forth. But we did have to go to court a few times, but we just couldn't agree. But by and large, we built that center of gravity and crafted a land use plan for Island County, which 25 years later, 30 years later, is still standing the test of time. Why? Because no one shot it down because we built it on a consensus reached through trust. And that's what it takes. It takes time. It takes trust. It takes a vision of the future in which two sides can see each other together, which, if you want to go back half an hour in our conversation, is what's missing in Israel-Palestine. There needs to be a vision of Israelis and Palestinians sitting down the way they did in 1910, for example, when you couldn't really tell the difference. Or you could tell the difference. But they worked together and lived together in peace. And that's the kind of vision that needs. It's the same vision we created in Island County, Washington, on a far more smaller stage. But that's what it takes. And like I say, it takes a certain amount of guts, too, because it means, first of all, facing down those people on your own side who were implacable, for example. My biggest problem was not the right wing. My biggest problem was the left wing, and I was a lefty. My biggest problem was people that wanted to preserve the life of every last rabbit in Island County. We're going to have to give some ground. We're going to have to compromise. The fence regulations aren't going to be exactly what you want. They're not going to be exactly what the farmers want, but something in the middle. We'll reach a compromise. And that way it'll stand the test of time. Yeah.
So I want us to dance back to when you started working with the UN especially when you started working on the I forget what the team was called, but on the nuclear strategy, I guess.
Nuclear Planning Group, the NP.
The nuclear planning group.
Yeah. The problem with the nuclear planning group is we were doing crazy stuff, and one reason that we were doing crazy stuff was that there were no women. No one, not a single woman on the U.S. side of it. In Europe, I suspect the Russians, it was the same.
Yeah.
Like, well, this was too tough a game. You couldn't flinch. If you were talking about killing 20 million people in 5 seconds, you couldn't flinch. You had to be a real man. Whereas I think had there been a single woman in the room, she would have just laughed at us and said, "You fucking idiots. What are you doing? Crazy. You can't do this." Because everyone knows every war game we ever did, every tabletop exercise we ever did showed that if even one nuclear weapon went off, it would only be about 3 days max before they'd all go off and the whole planet was a smoking ruin. So part of the problem was machismo, the same machismo we've been talking about for the last hour or so. The nuclear planning group. I mean, we even had something called, this is so crazy. I mean, your viewers may not even believe it, but we worked on a program called TIPAR, T-I-P-A-R. It was an acronym, and it meant Targeting to Impede Post-Attack Recovery. Okay.
Oh, I saw that.
What that meant was that there'd be a first exchange and then a reprisal and a second exchange. And New York and Chicago and Moscow were smoking ruins. So we would hit all the smaller towns and then even the smaller cities. And TPAR meant that when we got down to almost nobody left, the person that would win the war would be the person that could get off the mat first.
Wow.
And that meant that we had to save at least a few rockets and a few bombs so that we could make sure and kill every last cow in the Ukraine. I mean, so we could kill everybody so that it would be an American that crawled out of the cave and restarted the civilization and not a Russian. And that would be a victory. Can you believe that? Now, I can't believe that I spent months of my life working on these plans, but I did. Like I say, my climb up from that episode in Vietnam where I realized how shallow my life had become was 3 steps up and 2 steps back. And one of the steps back was working on the nuclear planning group and not having the guts to say, this is stupid, this is crazy.
I forget who was president at that time, actually. Was it Carter at that?
It went through several presidents, Nixon, Carter, and certainly Reagan. And it's still going on, by the way. The nuclear planning group still exists. And the same foolishness, people talk about the same foolishness about winning a nuclear war, which is crazy. And I shudder to read the newest military budgets, which have tens of billions of dollars spent on modernizing our nuclear arsenal. They don't understand. If even one of those things comes off, it's the end. It's the end. That's it.
Yeah. So speaking of nuclear war, though, I'll start with this, and then I'll ask you the other question I have in my head right now. But where some people will say we're as close to nuclear war as we've ever been. I'm sure you have. You'll say probably we've been closer at certain points in history. But we're at this stage now where the Middle East is going the way it's going, and in the Russia-Ukraine war, in that particular case, North Korea is weighing in, and we know, like, North Korean soldiers are on the ground in Russia as we speak, right? And we know the North Koreans have nuclear weapons, right? As do the Russians, as do the Chinese, I guess. So there's nuclear weapons sitting in a few hands in the world, like. In your analysis of the situation as it is right now, how close are we? Like, because the right with Donald Trump and some of the people on the right will tell you that it's impending, and I wonder how you feel about that description of where we are in the world right now.
No, it's not impending. It can be avoided, and I don't think it's any of the major players that will start it. Russia doesn't want a nuclear war, or else they would have already dropped tactical nuclear weapons. And when they were a year and a half ago, when they were badly losing in the Ukraine, they would have used tactical nuclear weapons, and they didn't. The Chinese are even more cautious. The North Koreans, they're cautious only because they have a tiny nuclear arsenal, and if they're caught using a nuclear weapon, well, you can kiss goodbye to the entire peninsula. We would just destroy it. They understand that. The real problem is Iran and Israel. That's where these people are desperate. I mean, the Israelis are desperate. Netanyahu is desperate to keep the allegiance of his people and be a tough guy. The Palestinians are still under the thumb of Hamas, and Hamas are just absurdly violent, and they probably would think a nuclear weapon would be just fine, but they don't have one, what the Israelis do. So my concern is, notice how the last 6 months or so, when the Iranians and the Israelis have been going back and forth with rocket attacks and assassinations. The assassinations have been irksome to the Iranians, but they haven't really replied. And most of the rocket attacks have almost deliberately missed. And I can't believe that the Iranians are so inept that they could send drones and rockets into Israel and miss everything. They meant more as warning shots across the bow. But if things get worse, this is the thing. When we were with the nuclear planning group, we never could solve the basic problem of, okay, what if it's not rational actors? We're rational actors. The Russians really are rational actors in many ways. What if it's not rational actors? What if it's some crazy that steals a bomb? Okay, that's a problem. Well, that's where we are now. We've got rational actors. I think the U.S. and Russia and China are rational actors when it comes to nuclear weapons, but the Iranians certainly aren't, and under Netanyahu, the Israelis aren't. And that's the problem. So, that's what I fear. And Israel being so small, even one or two nuclear weapons that, say, wiped out Tel Aviv would cause a massive retaliation by the Israelis that would take out Iran's 10 biggest cities. And then that wouldn't happen without starting World War III.
Wow.
So is it inevitable? No, I don't think it's inevitable. That Biden is struggling to do right now. And that's why, in some ways, I think the criticisms of him in the Middle East are overblown or unfounded. I mean, he really has to keep an eye on the bigger picture. Sure, it's awful what the Israelis are doing to the people of Gaza. Absolutely, it's awful. But to blame it all on Israel and inflame them to the point of making the situation worse vis-a-vis their retaliations on Iran is also stupid. So Biden's playing a bad hand, and I think he's probably playing it about the only way he could. Although I certainly agree with those that think that we should take a tougher line against Hamas. I don't know what to do, because if you cut off all weapons to Israel, then that will create an uproar. What I would do in Israel is I would immediately cut off all offensive weapons to Israel, the bombs, artillery shells, whatever, and continue to back Iron Dome and their other defensive measures. And the other measures they put into border troops to guard against a repeat of October 7th. I would do that because the Israeli reactions, goaded by Netanyahu's right wing and the settler farmers in Palestine and the West Bank, have gone way too far. Way too far. I mean, there's a proportional reaction. Everybody expected after October 7th, the Israelis would do something. And I think most of the world wouldn't complain if the Israelis invaded Gaza, tried very hard to kill as many Gaza soldiers as possible, and then withdrew. But that's not what's happened. Netanyahu has got to keep it up, because if he doesn't keep it up, he'll lose power and, incidentally, probably end up in jail because of the pending cases against him.
Right.
So,
So speaking of that, though, so one of the reasons Trump has been elected is because there's that idea that, well, he's as crazy as all these leaders, basically. If someone like, say, Putin comes out and says, threatens nuclear weapons or threatens some sort of military action, well, Trump is able to one-up him by saying, well, I'm going to, call in the nukes or something. Do you think that, as a person who has been in these diplomatic and dealt with the bureaucracy that goes into this, like, does that actually work? Like, can you just so the way I often tell this story is like, okay, you walk into a room and you're like, I can beat everybody here. Well, you don't know if there's a UFC fighter amongst the people in the room, right? So one day, like, you go out and you tell people, I could beat everybody in the room. Well, someone might call your bluff one day, especially if they know how to fight. Right? One of the reasons Trump has been voted in is because people say, well, he's seen as this crazy fella who is very unpredictable. And so this was how he kept the peace in the world in his first term. How do you assess that?
I don't know. It's funny because it goes way back. I mean, there's a famous anecdote about Richard Nixon at a time when the Chinese were really fiercely causing a lot of problems, and it looked like we might go to war with China.
Yeah.
And Nixon is walking with his aide, Haldeman, on a beach someplace. And Haldeman is saying, hey, Mr. President, you got to calm down your rhetoric. I mean, isn't this going to antagonize the Chinese? Because Nixon then was making all kinds of Trumpian threats.
Wow.
And Nixon looked at them and he says, Bob, he says, I want them to think I'm crazy. I want them to think I'm crazy. Because if they think I'm crazy, then they're not going to do anything. So, that's Trump's strategy. But that's a really high-risk strategy. And who knows whether that the Chinese would have responded the way they did in inviting Kissinger to China and establishing a time of relative calm in that area of the world. Who knows? I mean, and also Trump isn't nearly as smart as Richard Nixon. And he surrounded himself with a bunch of true crazies. I mean, people that everybody knows are crazy. So you can say, okay, Trump really is smart as the fox and he knows what he's doing. Anyone that listened to this campaign over the last year, it's very hard to agree with that he's smart as a fox and knows what he's doing. He knows how to manufacture and support his base by telling all these crude stories and acting like an idiot on the stump. Because people love that, especially these young men that see him as a super macho figure, the kind of person that I would have adored in my macho days.
I will say this, though, about the critique that you presented there about Trump's campaign. He ran a smart campaign, in my opinion, in the sense that he catered to what a lot of young people imagine if he came. And this was the biggest problem Kamala Harris had. And this is not where I want the discussion to go. But the biggest problem Kamala Harris had was she was trying to speak to people on a level that they were not willing to meet her on.
That's right.
Right. And Trump did all these. He spoke to people, he speaks to people on a level that they understand. You're hungry, I'm the guy to feed you. For some reason, people actually take that seriously, right? And he went to a bunch of one of the biggest strategies that maybe became really, really a winner for him in this particular election cycle was he went on a bunch of podcasts, like some of the biggest podcasts out there. He went to Joe Rogan, I think he went on Flagrant as well, just some really big podcasts. And I think the Democrats greatly underestimated that. Now, you might say, well, the discussion on a podcast is not necessarily on the same kind of intellectual level as going on like mainstream media, right? But he did that. And basically, the thing is he caters to people on the level that some might say in my generation and maybe younger, people are getting dumber, right? So he caters to people on that level. Plus, obviously, he's a relatable guy in some way. Possibly the reason why he won, but that's not necessarily.
Well, no, I think you raise a good point. I mean, but it's not to say also that the people that elected him are dumb. You need to respect the fact that a whole lot of people, mostly in the American South and red states in the American South, they're not dumb.
Fair point.
They just don't like being dissed. Their economic problems are severe, yeah, but the key thing is they don't like being dissed. And too many of the Democrats still diss Appalachians and Southerners as Hokies and whatever. Where there's got to be a way where Democrats can demonstrate their concern, a compassion, to use my word, what do you call them, lunch pail topics, and really begin to understand. The same way we began to understand the farmers in Island County by sitting on their tractor fenders, listening to them talk about their difficulties getting a loan from the bank. The Democrats need to do that, and they didn't. They started doing it. Harris made a few steps in that direction, but most Democrats didn't and paid a price for it. That said, as my wife would immediately say, hey, that's only part of it. Part of the fact is that a whole lot of Trump supporters really are racist bigots, and you have to admit that's true too.
Yeah. Yeah. So where I wanted to take this next before we kind of return back to the story there was just lastly, I wonder how you assess the role of NATO and in the Russia-Ukraine war right now, and how does that even end?
Well, first of all, the role of NATO is going to be increasingly important come January 20th. Trump almost certainly will do what he did last time around. He will, if not take America out of NATO, he will withdraw a whole lot from NATO and become a thorn in the side rather than a partner, which means that NATO has got to continue building a semi-independent military force. This is tricky because the more independent Europe becomes as a military force, the less influence the United States has. Right now, as the nuclear umbrella over Europe and stuff, whenever America talks, Europe basically has to jump. Not much as before, but still some. Jump a little bit. But if we are withdrawing ourselves and our protective umbrella, even the non-nuclear protective umbrella, then that means that Europeans are going to have to spend a whole lot more. European citizens are going to have to realize it's going to mean higher taxes so they can build bombs and tanks and stuff, some of which will go to the Ukraine because most Europeans rightly see Ukraine as a bellwether. If Russia grabs 5 provinces of Ukraine, then Poland's next. The Baltic states are next. Everybody sees that.
Right.
So it's existential for Europe. And so I think Europe will come together with the U.S. as a much less major partner. This may not be a bad thing. This may not be a bad thing. It may be that it's part of the realignment in the world, that America becomes less the kingpin and more as one of the bigger kids on the block, but not necessarily the dominant bully on the block. And that's probably not a bad thing. So, but yeah, Europeans are looking at a really existential crisis because after all, you put all the European arms together, they are way more powerful than Russia. And so they should be able to hold their own. And even if the U.S. supply of arms diminishes, what that means for Ukraine, I don't know. Can they completely replace U.S. weapons supplies to Ukraine? Should they? That's a good question. I suspect that Ukraine will be under enormous pressure now to end the war and accept losing those 5 or 4 provinces, as well as Crimea. But who knows? Without American supplies in Ukraine are enough probably to last at least until next summer, and then we'll see. But NATO is essential, and I think in many ways NATO is essential not for its original purpose, which, as you know, was as a counterpoint to the Soviet Union. NATO could be important as a global peacekeeping organization because it's pretty obvious the United Nations is never going to be able to fulfill that role because it vetoes on the Security Council. But on the other hand, NATO can rather quickly field military teams to deal with putting out brushfire wars or engaging in peacekeeping operations, providing buffering forces between warring factions, things like that, which could be extremely vulnerable in a world that seems to have a conflict around every corner. So I think there's a purpose for NATO. It's not its original purpose, but it's an important purpose as a peacekeeping organization. And I suspect that the Europeans see that, except for people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and a few others. But that NATO still sees that. And I think, let's say in 4 years that the MAGA Republicans are voted out of office, well, America will then jump back in and play a more robust role. But for the next 4 years, Europeans are looking at, hey, buddy, we're on our own. Not quite on our own, but we're a lot more on our own than we were.
It is what it is. So bringing it back to your time at on the nuclear planning group and what took place beyond that. So let's get back on that part of the story.
Well, I spent 3 years there and then was reassigned. I went from there to the United Nations. And the nuclear planning group continues and doing the same thing. And I'm sure there are all kinds of people on the nuclear planning group who still believe that a nuclear war is winnable, which is just nonsense.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously you went through a whole other transition where you felt like you took this turn where you wanted to heal the world, where you wanted to have impact in to impact public problems in a certain way. So I wanted to kind of learn about that transition and obviously eventually bring it on to Giraffe Heroes and what you do there now.
Well, I was just basically going to do that because I think that's where the story leads. I'm now 82, obviously not on the Foreign Service anymore, but I'm still a pretty damn good communicator. And so I'm doing everything I can. I'm writing books. I'm on a whole bunch of blogs. I'm even trying my hand at enlisting a large audience among young people with my TikTok and Instagram things. And when I speak and write, a lot of it is about the foreign policy problems of the world because I kind of know a lot about that. And so I'm doing what I can that way, which is what it's what I can do. And sometimes it has an effect. I mean, at least from the feedback that I get.
Yeah.
So, and also in talking to people, inspiring other people, I'm able to talk to younger people who are still in positions of power. And they sometimes consult me. Not like I'm Henry Kissinger, but they sometimes still consult me
Yeah.
about stuff that maybe should be done. And I think that's true for all of us. You pick up as my wife says, you pick up the corner of the rug you can pick up. And right now I'm picking up a smaller corner of the rug because I'm 82 and no longer employed by the State Department, where I used to pick up a much bigger hunk of the rug. And then at the same time, there's all the underpinning stuff, as we've talked about several times now. A lot of the war, a lot of the violence has underpinnings, and a lot of that underpinnings is my work with men, because there are a lot of men that feel like I did when I went to Vietnam. Hey, it's the only war I got. I'm young. I'm indestructible. Yeah, let's go out and shoot somebody.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is dealing with these enormously important issues of manhood. That leads us to the Giraffe Project, where we find and honor people who are sticking their necks out to solve public problems. That is to say, who've got the guts, the courage to look down and defeat oppositionist pressures in order to do something good for the world. And then we tell their stories, get their stories told on social media, websites, books, any way we can. And I urge, again, your viewers to go to giraffe.org and scroll down. At the top, you'll see a nav bar that has Giraffe Stories. You'll find 1,500 stories on it. Not all of them are foreign policy. In fact, most of them are U.S. domestic policy. But nonetheless, you'll find all kinds of stories of people doing brave things in order to make the world a better place. And this is because both my wife Ann and I are firmly a firm belief that telling stories is the most powerful way of creating change that anyone's ever found. I mean, it's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. I'm guessing that when Neanderthals were dancing around the fire and telling stories of their heroes, one of the impacts was to change the Neanderthal culture and to affect young Neanderthals. Well, it's the same thing. That's what we're doing now. The same thing in the Middle Ages with the troubadours. We often describe the Giraffe Project as being the troubadours for our age. That is to say, we're storytellers. We tell stories of heroes in order to inspire other people to be heroic too. And it works, just as it worked for the Neanderthals or the troubadours. It works in our age too. So that's a great use of my time until I finally drop dead. That's a great use of my time, is finding these heroes, telling their stories, being on podcasts and broadcasts and interviews myself. But it's all to the same theme. That is to say, that courage is absolutely key. Sticking your neck out is absolutely key. You got to do it. You got to do it. And to do it, one of the biggest challenge for almost everyone is to take the risk to find the real meaning of their life. I started finding the meaning of my life with that awful night in Vietnam and the encounter in California 6 months later. I finally realized that the meaning of my life could simply not be just adventuring. It had to be something deeper and broader and more helpful than that. And that's the same thing for all of us. We look around, you need to take risks, but the biggest risk of all is facing up to what you have to face up to find meaning in your life. And it's not through drink, and it's not through alcohol, it's not through power, and it's not through money. You'll find that out soon enough.
Yeah.
But those are ultimately trivial. The real meaning comes from service. The real meaning in life that people discover comes from some kind of service. And that service may be huge, like doing something big on global warming, or it can be really minor, like going down to your city council and complaining about a corrupt official or a polluted lake in your town. That takes a lot of guts too. So, find the meaning of your life, find the meaning through service, and then keep going. And if you're unsure of where to look around at who you are. What skills and resources do you have? Are you really smart? Are you good at math? Are you an artist? This. Take a stock of who you are, and that will help focus you on the kinds of issues you might take on once you decide to move and get off the couch and start making a difference in the world. I'm getting really preachy, but I really believe it strongly.
Yeah, no, I'm actually curious about some of the stories. Could you maybe share maybe one or two of the stories that you find the most impactful of people giraffe heroes?
Yeah, this last week, this is a story that has nothing to do with warfare, but it's one that impacted me anyway. A young woman in eastern Uganda, for example, I don't know if you know this, but in a lot of, not a lot, some African countries in the countryside, it's incredibly traditional and incredibly violent toward women.
Yeah.
Women have a terrible time. And it's not just that they have no power and that men are all the tribal chiefs. It's that they're actually assaulted. And some of you know some horrible physical practices that women have to endure in some of the tribal areas in Africa. So this young woman is attacking the entire traditional structure of chiefs in rural tribal Western Uganda. And it's incredibly dangerous because they really want her dead. And they want her dead right now because she's a severe threat to their traditional power. But she's going into these villages. She's telling women that they have rights, that they can fight back. She's showing them how to fight back. Then she spends half her time in Kampala lobbying the legislature for constitutional amendments, lobbying politicians to pass some laws that make it way more difficult for tribal chiefs to keep abusing women and give women a whole lot more power, not just the vote, but give them a whole lot more power, putting them in leadership positions, for example. So we made her a giraffe hero because she's sure as hell sticking her neck out.
Wow. Yeah.
And the other one I was looking at this morning was a guy from the Veterans Administration in the United States who uncovered a whole lot of corrupt practices, I'm sorry to say, within the VA about distribution of medicines, about bad bookkeeping, about a lot of stuff that shouldn't be happening, and wasting taxpayers' money and not doing full service to the veterans. And he complained to his masters, and he was summarily fired. And so he fought back, and he sued the Veterans Administration to get his job back as a whistleblower. And he did. And he's been central in some of the reforms or the impending reforms to improve our care of our war veterans. Those are two stories, and there's a bunch more.
Wow. That's amazing. So for me, those are just obviously we've been going for almost 2 hours now.
But it's my turn to cook dinner tonight, so we can't go too much longer.
Yeah. So I would like to end this conversation here. But your story, and I mean, I haven't read through your book Quest, and obviously you spoke about some of the other works that you put out there to try and inspire people. Obviously, the Denali Diary is also a big one that people should get to grips with when they can. And some of the work that you continue to do to this day, it's just really inspiring stuff. Like I took my time to really survey your profile and try and learn a bit more about you, because I feel like that's a story that I could use even for myself. You know,
I will say too that two things I've done recently is I'm creating an audio book out of Quest. It's about half done now. Yeah. And also, Denali Diary is going to be a electronic book. No, an ebook. Yeah, where you can read it online. You don't have to buy a paper copy. That's all happening. All this will be done in a few more months.
Yeah. So where can people find some of the stuff you still put out right now? Obviously, you spoke about your TikTok. What is your handle on TikTok?
I don't know. I know what it is. Sure. Yeah. It's Badass Granddad. Badass Granddad.
That's a great name. Is that your handle on everything, even on Twitter?
No, or TikTok and Instagram. I'm Badass Granddad.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's that. And other than that, my website has a lot of stuff on it, and that's just my name, johngraham.org. Giraffe Project with all those stories. That's giraffe.org. The book is Quest. That's a good start.
Yeah, no.
The political action book, for those of you who are already active in community change and political change, the name of the book is Stick Your Neck Out, published by Barrett Kohler in San Francisco.
Yeah, no, if you guys are looking to get Quest, which is a good summary of John's story, that is available on Amazon. Quick tip, if you buy the electronic copy, it's a lot cheaper. Anyways, Thank you so much for your time today, John. I really appreciate it.
Hey, we covered a lot, but if you want more, obviously you know where to find me.
Yeah, of course. And for you guys at home, if you're new around here, don't forget to subscribe and reach out to John. Let him know how this particular episode has impacted you. I'll see you on the next one. Take care, guys.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Wolf of Young Street podcast. If you derived value from this podcast, please don't forget to subscribe. I would love to hear from you as well. So please comment your thoughts down below.